Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, Florida, North America's first place city. Today we begin the story of how our streets got their names. Now that may be an odd title or odd subject for a program like this, but basically the subject was chosen because Pensacola has so many odd downtown street names. And many people over the years have wondered, how did they get there? Were they always that way? Well, the answer is no, they weren't always that way. They've been changed a number of times in some cases. And we'll begin at the beginning with what our streets were like, what they were named when the city itself got its new configuration back in 1763 and 4 when the engineer Elias Durnford laid out the city. The city itself, well, basically the streets, the squares, all of the downtown area was very much in its configuration as it is today. And of course, Mr. Durnford gave names to that community, to the streets along the way that were taken from the hierarchy of the British government at that time. One exception, of course, was he named one street for the governor at that time, Governor Johnstone, and there was one street named for King George, another one for Queen Charlotte, for Lord Bute, for the Duke of York, and for a number of other men who were prominent in the British configuration. And of course, those street names were in place up until the British were defeated in the siege in 1781. And of course, then the Spanish returned. And the Spanish, naturally, they left the city as it was in its background and its layout, but they changed the names of the streets. And this map that we have on the screen at this moment will tell you a little bit about what those streets were like. They're, of course, all Spanish, and those street names remained in place until early in the in the beginning of the 19th century. And then something rather unique happened. At this point in time, the so-called Napoleonic Wars began in Europe. And the people, of course, in Pensacola were very much interested in what was happening in their homeland, because early in that series of wars, the Napoleonic armies invaded Spain and captured it and took the reigning king, royal family, off the throne and replaced him with Joseph Bonaparte. Now, when that happened, of course, the British finally got into this overall battle, this overall war, and a British army began to invade Spain, and day by day, year by year, there was a series of battles which took place all the way across the Iberian Peninsula. And of course, the people here in Pensacola were very interested in this. They were using email, they were using CNN News, all of these things to get a day-by-day accounting. And as things happened, they got together and said, well, now, this is so important. Why? We just had this great battle. We just had this general did great things. Why don't we rename our streets to honor these things? And basically, that is what began to happen. For example, the name Palafox, which of course is paramount in our downtown area, was named for General Jose Palafox, who was a very, very successul leader in all of that. And along the same time, of course, another general named Romana was prominent in succeeding in ousting the French from one place. Now, as all of this happened, of course, the battles, the sieges took place year after year, month by month after month, and so we see names like Aragon and Barcelona and Rus and Seville and Zaragoza and Catalonia and Belmont, Tarragona. All of these were places where action took place. Let me repeat some of those. There are the key downtown area: Barcelona, Rus, Zaragoza, Alcaniz, Catalonia, Belmont, Tarragona. These were places where battles or sieges took place, and of course, back here, people would begin to cheer as all of this happened. Well, years went by. When the United States acquired Florida and Pensacola, and Florida itself became a territory of the United States, those names stayed in place, and basically people began to say, well, these are very classy names. Why? We don't want to change them. There's no reason to do that. But then step by step, we began to change names across the board. Now, I want to just look at downtown a little bit and think of some of the streets that you see as you pass along the way. And let's refer to how the streets got their names. Number one, we have Ferdinand Plaza. Now, that, of course, was done, that we chose that because the man who was king of Spain when the territory of Florida was ceded to the United States was King Ferdinand VII. And so we have Ferdinand VII, whose name gives us the name of the plaza. We have San Carlos, or rather, we have had the San Carlos title on the hotel downtown, which was prominent, and we had a fort named San Carlos, and still do out in the naval area. Of course, this was named for a king of well back, even further back in Spanish history. This was King Carlos II, who was the king of Spain at the time that the second Spanish settlement was begun here in 1698. Now, up on the bluffs, of course, above the naval station, in a prominent place for defense, where the British had a set of cannon during the British-Spanish siege, there was an area called the Barrancas, the high place. And so, very logically, people adopted that to apply it to a street downtown, and this indeed was why we have Barrancas Avenue today. Now, as things went along, as the city began to grow, we had need to place other streets in place. And so I want to kind of go over the map, going almost from south to north, as to why some of those streets that we have downtown have the names that they do. Let's just start right above Garden Street with Chase. Chase Street was named for Colonel William Chase. He was the man who built our three forts here that defended the Navy Yard. He also became the chief engineer and president of the railroad company when we built our first railroad up to the north. And Colonel Chase also was named by our governor to be the leader of the militia that captured the military sites here from the Federals back in 1861. Moving a block north, we come to Gregory Street. Gregory was named for Mr. Walter Gregory, and Walter Gregory was a prominent businessman who came here from New York with a lot of money, and he was the man who literally was the driving force to found our first bank here that we had beginning in 1833. Mr. Gregory was a financial figure here all the way up to the war between the straits. Move one block further north and we come to Wright Street. This was named for Benjamin Drake Wright, and of course we must consider his two sons, who were very prominent in slightly later years. Mr. Wright was an attorney. He also was the founder of the Pensacola Gazette, the first newspaper here in Pensacola. Yeah, Mr. Wright sat as a member of the Constitutional Convention when Florida's first constitutional document was written. And so his presence here was of considerable interest all the way through this time. We move a little bit further north and we come to Belmont Street. Now, Belmont Street had a sort of a political background. As we go through the city, as the city grew in the 1880s and 90s, we were moving to the north, and the railroad, led by, this was of course the Pensacola Atlantic and the Louisville and Nashville, had as its general manager William Chipley. And Mr. Chipley was certain that the Pensacola and its port were going to prosper greatly when a canal was dug across Nicaragua. So Mr. Chipley wanted to get more money from the board of directors of the Louisville and Nashville to build warehouses and docks at the foot of Palafox and Commandancy and so on. So he began to, well, I guess we would say he began to butter up the chairman of the board of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, who was a banker by the name of Belmont, Augustus Belmont. And so one of the things they could do that didn't cost them anything, Mr. Chipley was a part of the very active with the board of the city council, and he convinced them that the next street name applied going east and west should be named for Mr. Belmont, and that's why you have it. Now, then you come to LaRua Street. Unfortunately, they call it LaRua. The family, of course, was happy that the name was applied, but they were always a little unhappy because the family name is De La Rua, and of course, the De La Rua family was active in local government first as clerks of the court, for a time as county treasurer. They were in service in that manner for well over 100 years. And of course, the family is still very active in Pensacola today. We move, of course, a little bit, we've almost overlooked Cervantes Street in there. Now, I don't think that we have an honest historic reason for having Cervantes Street here. I suspect that as the city council was naming streets as the town grew, they knew that Cervantes was a prominent Spanish author, and so they said that would be a good. His name would be appropriate. Let's use it, and so we do have Cervantes Street. Okay, we move a little bit farther to the north, and you have a group of other names that were applied that were really historic. First of all, we want to talk about the name of Mallory Street. Mallory Street, of course, was named for Stephen Russell Mallory, and Mr. Mallory was not only a United States Senator, but also was the Secretary of the Navy for the Confederacy all through those 4 years. And of course, he had married a Pensacola girl, and he came back here and served as an attorney in retirement once the war was over. Right close to that, we have the name of his of some of the other activities of the people of that time. We want to recognize the name of Gadsden. Gadsden was a man who, of course, served for a time with Andrew Jackson. He was a member of Jackson's military complement. He went on in American history to become a diplomat dealing with acquisition of territories in the West. The so-called Gadsden Purpose was part of his activity, and so naturally Gadsden, when they began naming other streets, and they chose Jackson for one, they chose Gadsden as a kind of a complementary street, and so those two men are here. Of course, Andrew Jackson was our first territorial governor. Now, as we move forward beyond, in and around the streets of moving north, one of the streets that we have is Avery. Avery Street was named for a man who was a very prominent merchant in the town, one of the very first hardware merchants that we had here. He also served in city government for a number of terms, and it's very logical that the city council gave his name to a street. Maxwell Street was named for Augustus Maxwell, who was the law partner of Stephen Russell Mallory when Mallory came back here and went into practice once the Civil War was over. Blount Street was named for William Alexander Blount. William Alexander was a prominent attorney, began serving here well into the early part of the 1880s. He became very, very closely allied with railroad services across all of Florida. He also, of course, was one of the co-owners of what we call the Brent Block. This was the major downtown block, and he was the one who built the first Blount building and then the second Blount building when the earlier one was destroyed by fire. Mr. Blount was a very active local citizen, and of course, members of his family continued on in other activities as well. As we move just a little bit further north, we come to Lee Street. Now, a lot of people have felt, well, that was obviously named for General Robert E. Lee, but that was not the case. The council recognized a man by the name of William Franklin Lee, who had been the city and county surveyor for quite a number of years and had put down a very fine record of community service. And he married a young lady from the Lloyd family. And so the Lloyd and Lee connection there, when the city council got around to naming those streets, as they named further streets to the north, those two families were recognized in that way. Now, we can look, we step back, and during these times, I wish I could say that I was there and watched what the city council did. That's not the case. But nonetheless, they went back and they did their homework on a number of other activities that had taken place over the years. And we have DeSoto Street in that particular area because, of course, of Hernando Soto. And he has his activities that we've discussed him in the pre-colonial times, as how his work across the Alabama territory there ultimately gave rise to some of the information that made Pensacola a starting point for the DeLuna expedition. Now, going a little bit beyond that, over the fairly new street up in the Cordova Park area, or close to that anyway, is Villafane. And Angel Villafane, of course, was DeLuna's marching buddy, and it was Angel Villafane who came here with the relief expedition, which took off the settlers from the DeLuna expedition when it was decided that they would be removed. So basically, we have a core of these names that are historic, either on a national scene or in a local scene. And when we come back with episode 2, we'll talk about a few of the others which were a little bit unusual and whose sources might not be well known to you.